There are huge hedge fund managers, there are economists, and then there are leaders of nationwide associations, and they all have unique insights into farmland, operations, and investing. But you know who else does? People like Terry Engelken. Hi, I'm Dave Price, and this is the American Farmland Owner Podcast. Terry has seen a thing or two. He's been a lender in the small community of Washington, Iowa for a while now, long enough to have worked through the farm crisis of the 1980s. Terry is the vice president of Washington State Bank in Washington. Now, Washington is a community of about 7,500 people, which makes up about a third of the county's population. Before we get into how Terry shares his insights for a much anticipated index of rural America, let's first learn more about his town, its people, and its pigs. Tell folks what they need to know about Washington, Iowa. What's that community all about?
Well, we have several distinctions. One of them is we are, I believe, the largest hog producing county in the state and third largest in the nation. This is probably from 2022 numbers. And we also lead the state in cover crops. And we have a lot of diversification, but a lot of corn and soybean production.
And the town itself has about 7,500. I'm guessing the hogs outnumber the folks?
By quite a large amount. Yes. Many multiples.
Many multiples indeed. Now you've been part of the lending industry for quite some time, and it's always fascinating to talk to folks who've been around the block but can also share some perspective on this. Let's start with, what are you seeing right now? What's your assessment of how things are going in the economy?
Okay, the economy in general or ag?
Well, let's zero in on ag first and then broaden out.
Yeah. So in Washington County and surrounding areas, we had just enough moisture to produce an excellent crop this year for corn and soybeans. And that has helped offset the lower grain prices. But we are seeing a tightening of the current ratios. We're seeing the hog producers are kind of starting to recover from the last 2 years that were very disappointing financially for them. And so they're starting to come out of that a little bit with better hog prices and lower grain cost. One of the areas that I look at as far as experience back going into the 80s was we saw the poorest production land drop first in values. We're not seeing that quite as often right now because there's a lot of demand for hunting ground, so that kind of holds up the price on the very marginal ground superficially. But we are seeing less support for what I would call the medium ground, the 50 to 70 CSRs. Above 70, 75, it's still very strong.
And so you take part in the Rural Main Street Index that Creighton University does, and a couple of weeks ago we had Dr. Ernie Goss on to talk about it, and then there has been a new one since then, and you're one of the contributors to that. So with what we've seen with higher borrowing costs, inflation, although hopefully inflation's working its way down, although now we'll see, maybe it's kind of stuck right now as we talk. But how has all of this affected your industry with what we're experiencing?
there's much more stress on cash flows than we've seen. I've read some reports that anywhere from 25 to the worst case scenario I've heard is 40% of the farmers will have a very tough time showing a positive cash flow for the next year.
Hmm.
Um, I I haven't seen that it's as high as 40%, but we are seeing a lot of more stress than we've seen in the past because we've been very solid in this area and been very fortunate. Um, the when you look at corn being basically almost $1 lower than a year ago and
Yeah.
soybeans $2 lower, you can imagine what that does to cash flow if you got to knock a couple $100,000 off of medium-sized producers' current assets. That's not going to help any ratios any, and it makes it more difficult for lending.
And what is it like for, I mean, you're a part of the community, you've been part of a community, you're a community lender. What is it like when somebody calls you, somebody comes in, when you've reached a point where like you're talking about the increased stress, you have to look somebody in the eye who you maybe frankly have known generations of this family to say, I mean, you have to really assess whether you can extend more credit, right?
That is correct. We are a well-established bank. We've been around um, almost 100 years, over 90. And yes, we've got people that have several generations have worked with us. We try, number one, we try to look ahead to see if things are not working and identify issues as soon as possible. But we do try to work with our borrowers, and sometimes that means restructuring by um, terming out some of the short term debt and spreading it out over um, a few years. It doesn't help cash flow necessarily a lot, but it does take some pressure off the short term situation. And we try to um, big thing is if we can make the cash flow work and they can support the payments. So um, sometimes that means maybe having to restructure some existing debt and lower the payments for a couple years until things get back. The one thing I remember over the years is that everything cycles. So
Hmm. What's so that perspective that you have from being a lender in the 80s, what does that tell you about the current climate we're in?
it makes me nervous. The good news on that is we do not have as much debt, at least on real estate, as we've had in the back in the 80s when some lenders loaned up to 90% on farm ground, which when prices dropped 25%, there was no equity left.
Right.
So we're in a better position that way because we haven't had people loaning that amount or to that level. So we have more risk bearing ability than we've had. Now, it's been a real shock for a lot of our producers in the last year when interest rates basically doubled in the last 18 months for operating. So it's come back down a little bit with the Fed lowering, but that uh, that was a shock for people this year when they came in to renew or will be coming in to renew and see what their interest bill is. So that's a big deal.
The one thing that I struggle with, not coming from an economic background, is I see these headlines on different reports, and maybe this is just an indictment of our society in the whole, and that was sometimes we oversimplify things. But honestly, I get confused reading some of these headlines about how things are right now. And one of the things that struck me from the rural Main Street index was one of the headlines for there is rural Main Street economy soars to highest level in 15 months. I mean, that's a good thing, right? I mean, that seems like a positive.
That is a positive. We'll see if it continues, but yeah, and I think some of the optimism was because we did have, for the most part, very good crops this year in Iowa. There's some areas that didn't do as well as we did in this area, but they still had pretty decent crops. You had a few areas that got flooded out in northwest Iowa, but for the most part, it's amazing that we were able to produce what we did with the little bit of rain we had. It just strengthens my belief that the genetics that we have now are so much superior to what we had 40 years ago.
Another, and you hit on land prices a little bit, but another one of the nuggets that came out of this most recent report was that overall the bank CEOs and executives who were surveyed expected farmland prices to go down. I think it was 2.7% over the next year or so. What is it because there's been such a rapid escalation for so long that this was bound to happen, or are there other factors at play here?
I think there's several factors. One of them being higher interest rates has an impact. The other is that people's cash flow or their current position is tighter, so there's not as much cash in many situations to use for down payment. So that makes people a little bit reluctant. And also, if people are struggling on a cash flow, they really don't want to add more debt right now
Mm-hmm.
by making a purchase. So we're starting to see some of that, although we've had some strong sales here in the area in the last couple months also. So
What's your experience in your community as some of these folks are getting older and retirement age, and obviously a lot of folks in the farming community work along past the retirement age, but are you seeing is anything changing? Are you seeing these stay in family hands and just go primarily from one generation to the next? Are you seeing more folks getting out of the business? Is there anything you can share from your experience about trends there countywide?
I'm seeing both,
Okay.
but for the most part, the people that we work with are trying to keep it within the family if they can. Now, in some cases, there's young people do not want to come back to the farm, and so they might look to like a niece or a nephew rather than a son or a daughter. But we are seeing still that a lot of people are trying to keep it in the family as much as possible. Also, some people are just retiring and then renting the land out.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some people that have gotten out of livestock. One of the biggest concerns that I have for the state of Iowa is we need a lot of young people to want to get into the cow calf operation. And a lot of our cow calf people are getting up in age and uh, do not have somebody that wants to come in and take that over. And we really need to keep that going.
And what would what's the reason for it? Why are the young folks not willing to jump in there?
It's a lot of work.
Hmm.
Um, there's some young people that are very creative, and like when the cows are calving, they need to be checking on them maybe a couple times during the night. There are people that put up bring the cows that they're expecting to drop calves into a shed, and they have different areas of cameras. So they'll have, I know one guy has 8 or 12 cameras in his calving shed. And so he can look from his phone at night and see. He doesn't need to go out unless there's one that needs attention. So That that's something that I hope we get more of. But it's a awful lot of work, and people that have grown up with cattle typically enjoy it. But we've had a lot of people that have left the farm and gone on to do other things, and it's hard to get them back.
When you see that farm equipment sales have dropped for 16 straight months, those are those big ticket, big dollar purchases that folks are putting off, and probably in some cases as long as they can here because of their concerns about what's ahead. So how much of a concern is that?
Um, as a lender, I am glad they're trying to put that off a little bit.
Hmm.
Obviously, I don't work with many machinery salespeople, but people are really trying to keep things repaired and keep going rather than trading equipment. So um, from a lending standpoint, that's not a bad thing. At some point, they are going to have to replace, and then if we lose machinery dealers and like we did in the 80s, then there's less competition. So then they end up having to pay more. So we're hoping that they can work through this. But yes, it definitely on the big ticket items has had a large impact. And that also impacts your balance sheet if you depreciate out the equipment when you have a tractor or a combine that's worth 20% less than it was a year ago. You need to consider that.
We're talking in early December, so we're ahead of the Fed's next meeting, but by all accounts, it does not appear that we will see any kind of significant reduction in borrowing rates. When you're talking to folks, how do you counsel them on what to expect over the next year when it comes to that?
I always tell people that I have a crystal ball, but sometimes it has a crack in it. um, Seriously, we expect that rates will probably creep down a little bit more, but it's not going to be as fast as a lot of people were thinking. I We don't know the effect of tariffs yet, if there's going
Mhm.
to be tariffs. There's so many unknowns that I think the Fed's going to have to play it at one meeting at a time. And I'm not expecting a large decrease unless there's a real slowdown in the economy.
That's that is one of many things that I don't understand about your job. How do you have so many unknown variables to spit into your crystal ball? How do you process that? I don't understand that. You're talking about, well, we got, the trade. We'll see how the trade war goes, and you got prices, you got exports, you got weather concerns. That's an awful. Those are an awful lot of variables, right?
Yes, farming is um, in some degrees a lot like gambling. So, but people have done it for years. If you have a plan, you need to have a marketing plan. Most of our people have really worked on that. We've tried to focus on that, um, and don't try to do what a lot of people did 30 years ago, and that's try to hit the high price on everything. And it just doesn't work that way. You've got to keep things moving and price it over time. And a lot of people are trying to use hedges or forward contracts and things like that to help their marketing. You can be the best production farmer in the world, and if you don't market correctly, you lose a lot of your hard work.
So is that a key part of what you need to see somebody? So if I come into your office, what kind of questions are you asking me before you can determine, all right, this is a guy I can trust to pay this thing back? How do you determine what's the right risk? What do you need to see from somebody?
Uh, like most of our people, we try to run a 10-year trend. If
Okay.
we had somebody new coming in, we would want at least a 3-year trend from their balance sheets and see what's been happening in the operation. Obviously, we need to have a cash flow that's going to work. And then we ask, like if they're a cow calf person, do they use genetics? Do they use a bull? Do they use artificial insemination? Do they use embryos? Each one of those can be a tool that they use. We try to talk about marketing. How do they plan to market if it's grain, if it's livestock, and to see what they have done in the past and what they're going to look at doing in the future. So basically, our big things would be trend, current balance sheet, their position, how leveraged they are, and then what's the cash flow like.
And so how does that differ from somebody who's brand new and wants to break into this, who doesn't have that track record?
We still ask for cash flow to see whether they've thought through all their expenses, what they're going to need. We're I don't know how many off the top of my head, but we have several individuals that are just starting or expanding, and young people. And so we really try to work with them, and they're usually very good about coming in, asking questions. We compare tax returns back with their cash flow to see, how has it worked if they've done a little bit. I know a couple individuals that are renting more ground this year that started out very small, and then they're renting more. And another area that we have in Washington County is we do have some people that are really focused on the organic crops and even livestock. So we that's another avenue that some people are going to try to generate more income.
And are you noticing from some of these younger folks, do they primarily count on off-farm income as they get rolling into this?
Yes. Typically what happens is they're working full time and dad's wanting to cut back a little bit. So they'll rent 80 acres or 160 from dad and start out that way. And so usually having done that, they probably have some equipment that we can use for collateral to help secure the operating and get them started or expanded.
Terry, appreciate the deeper dive into this. Can you kind of leave us with what your gut tells you about 2025?
It might be a tough year, but hang in there. Things will improve. One of the areas that we have discussed here in the bank is that it doesn't appear that inputs are dropping especially for crops at this point in time. But if something can be done with the energy prices, that will, I think, eventually trickle down into lowering some of the input costs. That would be very helpful. The other thing we need to get a farm bill done sooner than later. So
you could have been saying that anytime over the last 2 years, right?
Yes, good, and I have been. Trust me, I'm not happy with Washington.
Yeah, no kidding. We'll see if 2025 is any different.
Maybe DC and not Iowa.
That's right. Terry, we really appreciate the time. Thank you for the insight.
Okay, thank you.
You can learn more about Terry Engelken in our profile piece about him. You can find that in the American Farmland Owner Weekly Newsletter. It's the place where landowners get their news. Get that newsletter emailed right to your inbox every week for free. Check it out at AmericanFarmlandOwner.com. Thanks for listening, and thanks for caring about the future of our farm.